I'll get started. So next week on Tuesday the 29th, we're going to have a review. And Thursday the 1st is the third exam. That's the schedule. Homework number 10 from chapter 13, the review questions 1 through 6 is due today. And homework number 11 will be due Tuesday next week. That's the chapter 14 review questions 1 through 7, chapter 15 problems 1, 2, and 3, and chapter 15 review questions 1, 2, 5, 10, and 11. So make sure you get those in. So we're going to finish off through chapter 16 this week. We'll finish chapter 15 today. We'll do chapter 16 on Thursday, and then we'll do review for the exam. So we were talking about injury and the stress continuum. If the stress on things is too low, you're in the pathologic underload zone, where you get chance of distress and increased injury risk. The physiologic loading zone within the eustress range is the range where tissue maintains its status. The physiologic training zone is the range in which tissue strengthens. And then if it's more stress than that, you're dealing with the pathologic overload zone, where you get distress in the form of injury. So imposed stress ranges from very low to very high. The physiologic loading zone is the level of stress to which the tissue is currently adapted. This is a maintenance level of stress, while the physiologic training zone, the level of stress is greater than that to which the tissue is currently adapted. This causes tissue microdamage, stimulating beneficial tissue remodeling. So the idea is that this uses this overload principle, where you systematically impose loads above the tissue's yield threshold, and you need to provide adequate rest time for beneficial remodeling to occur. So that leads into the issue about repetitive stress injuries. If you have too little stress, you're in the pathologic underload zone, where it's a prolonged exposure to a level of stress below the level of current adaptation. You get a detraining event, where the tissue weakens, bone demineralizes, muscle wastes away. This can happen from a sedentary lifestyle, immobilization, space flight, things like that. And then the pathologic overload zone is where a high level of stress causing substantial damage to the tissue. This can be because of a traumatic injury, a single application of a high level of stress, like a ligament tear, a bone fracture, muscle avulsion, or an overuse injury, repeated application of a lower level of stress. And here's the model for overuse injuries. When you increase your training effort, this increases the stress to tissues, which causes microscopic tissue damage, which leads to tissue remodeling. If the rate of remodeling is greater than the rate of continued tissue damage, you get stronger tissue and can increase your training effort more. However, if the rate of remodeling is less than the rate of continued tissue damage, you get an overuse injury, because that damage builds up. So you need to decrease your training effort and allow tissue remodeling. So for overuse injuries, they're caused by repeated applications of a stress lower than required to cause injury in a single application. There's no single identifiable incident that causes injury. It's a buildup of small damage that doesn't have enough time to recover. And this reflects the number of repetitions and the stress magnitude. So higher magnitude of imposed stress, you have fewer repetitions required for injury. And adequate rest for remodeling to occur is critical. So without recovery time, stress is reimposed on still damaged tissue, and it becomes more damaged. So the basic idea is that a low frequency of high stress is safe, but as the frequency increases, the stress that's safe that will lead to injury gets less and less. So you can have a low stress activity that you do with high frequency, or a higher stress activity that you do with low frequency. But if you have a medium stress activity that you do with medium frequency, and the frequency is not low enough, you can get an overuse injury in this area. And then individuals have differences in their tissue threshold. The stress threat, so preventing injury can be complicated by the fact that the stress thresholds differ among different tissues. Bone has a higher threshold than tendon, which has a higher threshold than ligament, which has a higher threshold than cartilage. And the tissue thresholds vary according to the direction of the stress. Bone is strongest in compression, then tension, then shear, while ligaments and tendons are strongest in have the highest threshold in tension, then shear. And they just don't do compression. So it's very hard to get a compression injury. And the thresholds differ among people. This can reflect genetics, training, nutrition, various tissue adaptations from the past. And so the time to remodel differs among tissues and individuals. So this is something you sort of have to track. Now, injury can be affected by both intrinsic and extrinsic factors. Intrinsic factors are factors related to the individual. They determine an individual's ability to withstand loading. They're properties of the individual. While extrinsic factors are related to the task and the environment. These are characteristics of the imposed loading. So they're due to the task being performed or the environment in which the task is being performed. They're internal and external. So some intrinsic factors are things like your skeletal alignment, your muscle strength, your muscle endurance, and your current level of fatigue, your joint flexibility and your tissue temperature, your joint alignment, your bone mineral density can be, which is affected by your diet and hormone levels, your previous injury history, your muscle firing pattern, your body mass, which is affected by your body composition, and various psychological factors like motivation and pain tolerance. And they affect things like the pattern of stress imposed on tissues, the magnitude of loading and shock absorption, the loading pattern of various segments, the area that force is distributed over, the strength of bone, tissue threshold, and like pain threshold. Well, extrinsic factors are things like the nature of the task. Is it a single discrete action versus repetitive or continuous actions, which affects the magnitude of loading and recovery? The pattern involved, which affects which tissues are loaded. The intensity of the performance, which affects the magnitude of the loading. The frequency of the performance, which affects your recovery time. Your environment can be things like your playing surface. The slope can affect the magnitude and direction of the loading. The hardness affects the magnitude of loading and friction. The material condition affects the magnitude of loading and friction. Your equipment, things like your footwear, like outsole materials can affect the magnitude of friction. Your midsole materials can affect the amount of cushioning, the amount of padding you have. Also, you can kind of like the thickness of your footwear can affect the magnitude of the torsion involved for various forces. And the level of participation, is it recreational versus competitive? In the various skill level of opponents, this can affect the magnitude of the forces involved. And then the rules for the sport or the game can affect the magnitude and frequency of loading and the pattern of the force distribution. So basically, intrinsic factors set the threshold value for the level of stress that can cause injury, while extrinsic factors reflect the potential for a given performance to impose a stress exceeding those values. So the risk of injury to an individual performing a particular task reflects an interaction of the intrinsic and extrinsic factors at that instant. So if you have a relatively low threshold value, it doesn't take a lot of, basically, if you have many intrinsic risk factors, it's more like, there's a threshold where the extrinsic factors will be high enough, and you'll have injury. If you have many extrinsic factors, there's a threshold where your intrinsic factors will be high enough and you'll have injury. But dealing with one or the other can help keep you in the safe zone. And they can interact. So here we have an intrinsic factor, the slope, which affects the alignment of your hips. And then we have a person here who has skeletal alignment differences where one hip is higher than the other. And here the slope aligns his hip properly. And here we have a person who has one hip lower than the other. And here the slope, his foot doesn't make it all the way to the ground on the slope. So another useful thing is something called cross-training. It's a training program incorporating day-to-day rotation among a variety of activities. And because each activity, well-designed cross-training, each activity will oppose a different pattern of loading on different tissues, and this provides time for remodeling to occur. And this avoids the cumulative effect of repetitive loading. So you can have cardiovascular training, including running, cycling, swimming, dance. And then you can also have like strength training of various muscle groups. So by moving what you're training around, you give time for what you trained last to recover and remodel. And you can also have within activity cross-training where you alter performance parameters when performing the same physical activity to avoid cumulative loading. So if you're doing a running program on a regular basis, to cross-train within that, you can train on different surfaces and different shoes. You can run at different speeds on different inclines for different durations and vary your loading patterns to avoid repetitive loading. There are also interventions to decrease the risk of injury during the performance of a task. You can consider anthropometrics when selecting a skill to perform. Things like posture will affect the pattern of loading imposed on the body. You can select appropriate training equipment and locations. You can include cross-training and within activity cross-training to alter the pattern of loading regularly imposed on the body. So you're not constantly loading one set of tissues so they have time to recover and strengthen. And set reasonable improvement goals. So avoid too much too soon. You want reasonable frequency increases, reasonable intensity increases, and reasonable duration increases. Increase gradually. Don't increase suddenly and in big steps. So here's an example of patterns of stress over a runner's foot. Move. So this was something measured with a stress meter in different parts. And this is some examples of the typical patterns of the ground reaction force components for a rear foot and a forefoot. So this is rear foot is the solid line, the forefoot is the dash line. As it strikes the ground at 3.6 meters, running at 6.6 meters per second. And then this is the center of pressure pattern, how it moves for the left foot as you run. You can see how they move. So again, the solid line is the rear foot that you're taking off with. The dashed line is the forefoot that's hitting the ground. This is the typical pattern of rear foot motion during the stance phase of running. Contact, inversion, immersion, the maximum rear foot angle, and toe off. And so if you're running with a rear foot, so this is with, this is if you have a rear foot striker, if you strike at the rear of your foot as opposed to a forefoot striker, if you strike at the front of your foot when you're running, yeah. And the loading of a muscle activity in the lower leg when running with a rear foot strike pattern, you can see here with geometry. If you strike on the edge of your foot, you get this effect here, and that can be affected by the thickness of your soles and things like that. So that can have an effect on the potential for injury risk. You know, the extra distance from the thickness of your sole can increase the potential torque on your ankle if you land off center. So that's a difference in technique to reduce injury. And I think I'll stop there today, and I'll cover chapter 16 next time. On Thursday. So that was the end of chapter 15. That's all you need for the homework. And I'll go through chapter 16 on Thursday in our meeting then. So I'll see you guys on Thursday. Have a nice day.